Um, Got to get the YouTube going, and then we will start. If I can figure out how to do that. Oh, darn it. It never ends. Hi, everyone. My name is Nick Dagan Best, and I'm not streaming from YouTube yet. So, now live on my channel. Okay, it is live. Fantastic. Apparently. Let me double check that this is the case, because I've been fooled the last couple of times. Friday, I did a stream. You see it says live, but nothing's happening. Or is it? Yeah. Okay, it is happening. It is live on YouTube. It's live everywhere, so I can stop worrying about this and move on with the stream. Yeah, I've had some screw ups, all my fault, because I'm still figuring out this live stream stuff. Friday, I did a live stream, but it didn't make its way to YouTube. And then yesterday, we did the team stream. It's myself and Patrick, and the stream that went to YouTube was just my webcam, and not, Patrick was cut out of it all. But thankfully, his channel had the proper double team action. So there you are. I apologize for the learning curve, and for all of you being patient with the learning curve that I'm adjusting to. As you can tell from my beard, I'm an old man. Technology is frightening and unfamiliar. Yes, I'm just a scared old Gen Xer who is way in over his head with some of this stuff. Anyway, back to subjects that I'm maybe a little bit stronger on. Let's see. I had some plans to talk about some stuff. Now, the last solo stream I did the other day, I'm looking from my window here. Thank you, Vera. Thank you for saying, Tavian and Vera already getting some nice comments. Thank you. So Friday's stream, I was talking about the Venus synodic cycle and Russian history. I'm going to break that down into clips if you missed it, because like I said, it didn't wind up airing on YouTube. I'm going to break it into clips, and I'm going to be doing that with a lot of these live streams. That's sort of the big project for the week, is to go through all the clips, annotate them all, but also sort of break them up by subject, like you sometimes see. So there's some bite-sized chunks and things that you might want to rewatch or that you've missed. Makes it nice, and you don't have to sit through the whole 1 hour, or yesterday was a 3-hour stream, quite formidable. I think as we get better at this, that makes it easier for us to do longer streams, because I think as you might have been able to detect, the earlier streams, we were struggling with technical failures and what have you, and it just sort of throws you off in terms of what you want to do. Okay. I do have a sort of esophageal condition, so you might notice sometimes when I'm speaking, I have to stop and do a little swallow. It's really involuntary on my part. Not a lot I can do about it, so hopefully it's not too irritating. And if it is irritating, hopefully you're someone I don't care about irritating. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, I'll it is what it is. If it can't be helped, it can't be helped, and I hope folks can understand. Now, well, I've already got some people popping into the comments. So I'm almost thinking, rather than have me decide what we're going to talk about, maybe I'll try taking requests. Let's see how this goes. I'm not promising anything. If you guys suggest something that I'm not really either prepared or interested in talking about, I might not take the suggestion, but hey, what the heck. All right, great seeing you too. So any requests? Folks have been watching, like, you saw the chat I did with Patrick yesterday. Maybe it brought up some questions that you'd like me to answer, or maybe there's some, we did a lot of, I tend to cover, okay, Kai cut up with the Russian show. Great. Yeah, I don't know. Should I talk politics? Should I talk music? Should I talk cinema? Where are we going? What do folks feel like? What do they want from their Nick Dagan Best live stream today? So far, I'm just getting compliments, which is all very nice. Thank you. I guess I'll give it another minute, and if nobody pipes in with any suggestions, I'll drop that idea and reclaim control of the program. But I've set it loose in the interest of seeing what happens. I do like to. That was part of the idea of doing these live streams. Is Patrick and I really just wanted to. Just chat and not necessarily have like this scheduled program or like, if you watched yesterday, we went all over the place. I can't imagine any other show where people would talk about John Coltrane and the Sex Pistols like in the same live stream. More music, cinema would be awesome too. Kate's asking for triplicities. That's I'll say this. Yeah, I mean, triplicities. I think the main thing, if I covered triplicities, I would really do it in a talk about annual perfections, and there's a good reason for that. I don't do as much sort of natal analysis. I mean, I do as a working astrologer. There's some amount I do of that, but when I'm sort of teaching astrology, I really like to go into the storytelling, and yeah, it's a little harder to do. Anyway, I'm getting some good suggestions here. Have I spoken about what Venus cycles our current political people belong to? No, I haven't. And well, I did sort of briefly yesterday, but I can recap that. Fortuna Mu, I don't know if you caught the team stream yesterday. I did a little bit of that. I mentioned the Venus synodic cycles of DeSantis and Trump. Now, let me just go through these other comments. Columbus, America. Okay, you missed yesterday, Fortuna Mu. Okay, so I did talk a little bit about that Fortuna Mu, but it's a 3-hour live stream, and it was only in the last hour of the 3 that we talked about politics. But I did go into DeSantis as a red 2 interval. I was talking about the 2015 debates. Oh heck, maybe should I quickly sort of recap this, and then I'm just trying to catch up. Now I'm getting a lot of big Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin fan. Okay, yeah. I've done some work with Frank. I'm still sort of it's not as developed as I have on some people, but I do have some work there, and we could sort of explore it together. That's not a bad idea. I mean, I cover musicians from all different sort of styles and eras. Naturally, I'm particularly interested in 50s, 60s, 70s, but I cover all the periods, the 90s, the 40s, some of even the 30s and 20s. Although the 20s get kind of nebulous because all my favorite recording artists from the 20s. Tend to be like sharecroppers from Mississippi who, no one knows what day they're born, that kind of thing, no birth certificates, which is actually something I've had to come across a lot. This is the thing. And part of how I've developed as an astrologer over, I'm coming up to the Saturn return of my starting to study astrology. That'll be, yeah, Saturn was in Pisces when I started studying astrology. So I'm within a year or so of that Saturn return. So in that time that I've been studying, there's always been this problem for me that I really love to study people's lives, famous people, mostly musicians, especially when I started. When I started studying astrology, I mean, everything about life was music related, and I still had interest in the other art forms, and I was, somewhat political, but music by far sort of overshadowed everything I did. And then, as I get older, I guess it gets the emphasis shifts a little more to politics, but I haven't changed that much. But long story short, there were musicians like Charlie Parker, John Bonham, other musicians like that for whom we have no available time of birth. And it seems we never will. We can never look at their horoscopes. And and then as I got more involved in just sort of studying history, I mean, there's a lot of other people for whom we will never know the dates of birth of, say, Sitting Bull, Shaka Zulu, people born in cultures that didn't document birth information. I'm not trying to fault anyone for it, but it's just that's the fact of the matter. When it does come to studying people like that, I mean, this is the method. This is part of how I got so focused on planetary synodic cycles is if you can't study someone's life horoscopically, you can still put together a timeline and study sort of the transits of their lives. Now, Charlie Parker and John Bonham, at least I know their dates of birth and where they were born. So there's for those for musicians like them, there are other examples like them. But yeah, for guys like them, at least I can look at transits to their planets, even if and you can make some attempt at rectifications, which I do as a sort of intellectual exercise. But for people like I mentioned, like these giants of the 19th century, Sitting Bull, Shaka Zulu in Africa, Sitting Bull in America, and all kinds of figures like that who will never know what their charts are like. We still know about the battles. We know a lot of stuff about their lives, the battles they fought, migrations they made, when they died, how they died, that kind of thing. So there's still some study, there's still some astrological knowledge that you can sort of dig through and extract, which I think is important. So it's helped me broaden my horizons, knowing that I couldn't just sort of rely on horoscopic methods, that I had to find other ways to sort of use astrology to look at people's lives if I could look at the people I was really interested in. All right, I'm trying to all right, someone suggested Eminem. I've done some work on him. Freddie Mercury, yeah, okay. I won't be able to get around to everyone today, but these are, I mean, I've got an Eminem file. I've definitely got a Queen file. Someone's suggesting Tina Turner. Kate's asked if that's too soon. It's not too soon. It's been a while since I looked at her though. And the thing about Tina Turner is that she really disappeared from the scene for the last 20, 30 years of her life, really. She kind of I don't remember seeing her do anything, even in the 90s. If I have to think really hard, that there would be an occasional interview. I read a biography a few years ago. But most of the time I like to study people who, are where I can account for every decade of their lives and what they were doing. And, Tina, bless her, she sort of retired to life, a quiet, peaceful life in Switzerland. And sort of disappeared from the scene. But I do have some charts of like, earlier recording sessions, that the years with Ike, certainly the years after Ike, when she exploded as an 80s icon. Of course, she also did little side gigs like singing backup on a Frank Zappa record, a couple of Frank Zappa records actually, all done in the same session. So yeah, she's definitely someone who's interesting to me. But yeah, I'm glad that everyone's sort of pitching in with suggestions. Rivka White suggests famous bands of the 80s and 90s like Radiohead or the Smiths. I've never been the biggest Radiohead fan. I like them okay. Patrick Watson is a major Radiohead fan, so maybe that's something we do in conversation with him, because he's a bigger fan. My stepdaughter is a big Radiohead fan, and she wasn't even born when they released most of their records. Now the Smiths, that's another story. I was a massive Smiths fan in the 80s. Saw them live. Yes, I did. Saw them live August 1st, 1986, shortly before I turned 18. Yeah, we just lost the great bass player in the Smiths, Andy Rourke, who, the thing about the Smiths, I feel the same way about the Smiths that I do about the Doors, in that I'm a really huge fan of the band. And both of those bands have these sort of iconic singers who, they were important, obviously, to the band, but they're sort of their mythology and their personas often sort of overshadow the other members of the band. Whereas my interest is really about how those four musicians work together. That's how I feel about the Doors. That's how I feel about the Smiths, like truly bands, where the drummer is just as important as everyone else. Not that Morrissey treated Andy Rourke or Mike Joyce as being important as himself and Johnny Marr, but that's because he just didn't understand the Smiths like I do. That's what I got to say about that. Yeah, I'm drinking from a Rocky Horror Picture Show coffee mug. I should explain I'm in Montreal because my dad's had a health crisis. This is my hometown. So, I've been staying at my parents' condo while it's a long story short. I'm staying at my parents' house. My mother is staying in another place, and my dad is now at a nursing home, but he was in the hospital. So long story short, my mother's name is Janet. So this coffee mug is actually my mom's, and there you are. That's how cool my folks are. They have a Rocky Horror Picture Show coffee mug. Edith Piaf, that's a great idea. Actually, someone mentioned Frank Sinatra and Edith Piaf. I study them as a pair because they're only born a couple of days apart, and I really love to do that kind of thing. And maybe I'll have to sort of prepare for that one. But that's something I've been meaning to do for, excuse me again, quite a while. Because I have decent chart files on Edith Piaf and Sinatra, and this way you can study their lives sort of, together because their charts are very similar. It's the kind of thing where their moons are in different signs, but everything else is pretty much the same. And yeah, I love studying those sort of time twin style charts. And Sinatra and Edith Piaf are a real sort of natural. So that's something I would like to talk about sometime. But that's a great suggestion, and I'll combine those two suggestions. I think because you get that much more learning out of studying several people born close together, and how their charts respond to the same transits and what have you. Okay, Kate's asking about the Mars retrograde and Gemini square Neptune for the more recent stuff. Yeah, well, that's I definitely have a lot to say about Mars retrograde, generally speaking, and I would certainly get to the Gemini thing. But it would probably more likely. I tend to sort of I don't just focus on one particular Mars retrograde. Although that's another approach I can try sometime. Something I've been thinking. Right, I'm not even jumping on. I'm reading everyone's suggestions, but this is good. This is just how we'll get started, and then I'll get into the astrology soon. But I don't want anyone to feel sort of neglected. Um, yeah, copyright and artist work with changes coming with Uranus and Gemini. Yeah, I mean that's getting a little ahead of me. Talking about Sitting Bull, do we have a chart of General Custer who was defeated by Red Cloud? Yeah, we do. We do have a birthday for Custer. And uh, his last stand occurred during a red 3 Venus retrograde transit, during the United States first centennial, in July of 1876. So that is something I can look at some point. There's definitely some interesting thing. But my favorite thing to do, like, what would be really interesting to do in covering Custer, would be to try and find as many birthdays of the men who were with him and went down that day, and look at a sort of, uh, uh, I forget how many soldiers he had with him. I don't know how many of them are sort of documented the way he is, but I always like looking at groups, especially when it comes to battles. And at the best of times, I mean, the really great thing is when you can look at battles between two armies, and the birthdays of the generals on both sides, and some of the soldiers on both sides, which is something, again, I mean, it's easier to do with things like the Civil War, for instance, because we do have birthdays for everyone on both sides of that. But nonetheless, yeah, Custer would be interesting. Um, all right, okay. And Tavian also suggested the Count Basie Orchestra. Yeah, Count Basie would be great. Duke Ellington's orchestra is the one I've done more work with than Count Basie. Duke's orchestra, that was really an amazing cast of characters, like guys who they were, some of them were together for like 30, 40 years. But some of them really hated each other, and they would, pull knives on each other. There's loads of amazing stories, incredible stories about those musicians. And of course, each and every one of them was just a musical powerhouse. And it's amazing that he kept such a large band going for so long. All right. Let's see. Well, I'm gonna have to think about where to start today. Let's see. Well, okay. I'm gonna start by sharing my screen and pulling up the old software. And let's see here. All right. Yeah, this is my Smiths file. I haven't looked at it in a long time. Oh yeah. Okay. At one point, I found a birth. This is years ago. This is like over 20 years ago. I found what a picture of Morrissey's birth certificate, but it didn't have a birth time. I was soon to find out that, in fact, um, birth certificates in England don't have times of birth. They do in Scotland, but not England. So it's usually impossible to get a British person's time of birth unless it was recorded by, the parents or something like that. But that being said, I'll just start. I don't have anything sort of, I don't have any. Oh, yes, I know what I can say about this. I remember my old sort of thing about the Smiths. Morrissey has a Sun Pluto square, right? Mike Joyce, the drummer, has a Sun Pluto square. Two Geminis, the two guys in the Smiths who like each other the least. Andy Rourke, who we just lost, as I was saying, does not have a Sun Pluto square. But what was my thing about him now? Okay, I'm that's the thing. I'm trying to remember work that I did like 20 years ago. Johnny Marr also doesn't have the square. But what does happen to Johnny Marr over the course of the Smiths, like this is their first gig. And when the Smiths started, Pluto was still in Libra. This is the Saturn-Pluto conjunction of 1982, just coming out of that conjunction, or just about to happen. But most of the Smiths, like by the time they get their recording career happening, Pluto goes into Scorpio by then. And when the Smiths break up, let's see here. Yeah, this was the statement of Johnny Marr that he was quitting the band. And Pluto was conjunct his Sun. Right. I'm just trying to remember how Andy Rourke fit into this, because I remember it was a sort of a whole band thing. I think, well, first of all, when Johnny Marr quit the Smiths, Pluto was conjunct his Sun. And, the two of the other guys in the band have these Sun Pluto squares. How would Pluto sort of describe the music of the Smiths? Sort of hard to say. I mean, I think the thing about the Smiths were, they were truly sort of independent. They were one of those few bands in the 80s who could really do things on their own, on their own. They didn't have to answer it to anyone. They didn't have to do things the way some marketing or PR guy wanted them to do things. They didn't really want to make music videos. Eventually, one was made for How Soon Is Now, which is a really cool video. That was what got me into the band. I remember I had read about them in a magazine a couple of times. I wasn't too intrigued, but then I heard How Soon Is Now and saw that video, and I was like, holy moly, it's the greatest song of the decade. I still think that's probably the greatest song of that decade. Okay, let me see. Okay, Morrissey has a Libra ascendant. That's what someone has. Maz just had his Mercury retrograde by secondary progression recently, I believe. Was looking it up the other day. Okay, Bliss to be, we'll have a look at that. And Nick, can I show the charts of Mike and Stephen Patrick again? Since their huge financial debate confrontation, it was some years after Marr left for The. Yeah, that was the strange thing. Johnny Marr left the Smiths and he played with he played with the Pretenders. He might have been with the Pretenders before if I remember correctly. Um, I was devastated. I remember that summer so well. It was almost a year to the day after I'd seen them live, and oh yeah, Ramsteed's charts. I've also looked at Ramstein. Um, yeah, okay, all right. I'm getting fantastic suggestions. Obviously, I won't be able to cover all of this in one day, but I'm really glad that I've got an audience that has such great taste in music. If you were all like requesting Barbara Streisand, no disrespect to Barbara Streisand, but I just really don't like her music. There actually, I've studied her life astrologically a little bit, and there's some interesting things to say. But when I usually do these studies, I go really in depth, and I get to know like the whole catalog of music and what have you. But when it came to Barbara Streisand, I was just, I can't listen to this. It's just not for me. Yeah, I'm going to put up a buy wheel of Morrissey and Mike Joyce. I was thinking the same thing. How it's funny that for those of you who don't know, it was quite a while after the Smiths broke up. Mike Joyce and Andy Rourke filed a lawsuit for royalties, I believe, as I recall. Morrissey's attitude towards the rhythm section is they were just that, the rhythm section. He thought of them as being disposable. And this was something, but I really, I always found Morrissey hilarious. I've never been a Smiths fan who thought they were, um, some people who hate the Smiths sort of think of them as this mopey band. I'm like, well, you just don't get it. The whole thing was hilarious. The Smiths, Morrissey's a comedian. Naturally, I'm not as sort of fond of him as I once was. I think he's turned out to be kind of a douche in a lot of ways, if excuse my French. But there's no denying his talent, and I can still enjoy Smith's records. I mean, I'm a Gen X guy, and so I grew up admiring all kinds of people who with hindsight are kind of dodgy. I grew up watching the movies of Woody Allen and Roman Polanski and what have you, and so I right or wrong, I can sort of look at I can separate the artist from the art. If they produce great art, I can appreciate that. I wouldn't say Morrissey's as bad as either of those two guys, but he's got some pretty shitty attitudes, in my opinion. But long before he sort of revealed those shitty attitudes, I really hated the shitty attitude he had towards the rhythm section in the Smiths. Because as I said, I think they are just as important as him and Johnny Marr. Sure, Morrissey and Marr wrote the songs, and that is a something. That's not nothing. But yeah, going back to like that first Smith song that I heard that blew me away, How Soon Is Now? No doubt that tremolo guitar is super catchy. But come on, the rhythm section, what Andy Rourke is putting down on the bass there, that's what ropes you in. Morrissey's a fool if he thinks that, the whole thing to that song is just that hilarious angst of being in the double entendre wordplay of being a son and heir, and all that stuff. Yeah, he's not the same. Anyway, they're both Geminis with the Sun square Pluto, and I'm trying to think, why did I think Andy Rourke? This is the thing. I literally, folks, that the year I made this file, I made this file over the winter of 2002 to 2003. That's when I made the Smiths file. I haven't really revisited them since then. This is the late Andy Rourke, who just died earlier this month. Oh, I guess he died not long after Pluto was conjunct his sun, come to think of it. So, like, yeah, Johnny Marr quit. This is not something I would have realized 20 years ago, of course. This is more recently. Andy Rourke died, I believe, of pancreatic cancer. And I don't know how long he had cancer, but apparently he had it for a little while. But yeah, Pluto was conjunct his sun fairly recently. So yeah, there seems to be some kind of weird Pluto thing going on with the Smiths. Let's see, I'm checking the comments again. Oh yeah, I got to look at his progressed Mercury. Nick Cave. Yeah, he went to the coronation. I saw that, and he said he had mixed feelings about it. Um, um, Sorry, I'm just scrolling through the comments here. Um, yeah, Nick Cave. I've never been that big a fan of Nick Cave. I like him, I respect him, but I don't put on birthday party records that often or what have you. But I'll tell you, Nick Cave wrote an amazing book that blew my mind. I read it in the 90s, a book called And the Ass Saw the Angel. And that's one of the best books I've ever read. Really incredible novelist. And I like his music fine. I'm just not like a massive fan. Before I move on from the Smiths, let's just look at this progressed Mercury of Maz's. Yeah, there's this progressed Mercury in Leo. Oh, his progressed Sun is now in Leo. Morrissey is now a Leo. Um, in by secondary progression, that is. So let's see. If I go back a year, how long ago did his progressed Mercury station retrograde? Oh yeah, just fairly recently, 2021. Okay. Does anyone know? I'm not really keeping tabs on Morrissey. I mean, like I said, I know that Andy Rourke just died, but anyone know what Morrissey's up to? What that progressed Mercury might signify? Let me know in the comments. Okay. Now it's occurring to me, one thing I can do that's maybe a bit more structured. I wanted to just sort of open up the floor, get to know you folks a bit, know what you're interested in. Um, and these are all really, really good suggestions. Um, but I think what I'll do, I want to take you folks through the Venus synodic cycles of some bands that I've been studying. And there's some really interesting results in some cases, especially bands where you had siblings or spouses. Um, so I'm going to open up a lot of these, and we'll have some fun because there's some interesting things to show here. And yeah, well, we'll start with the A's. Basically, a lot of the Venus signatures that you get in bands are very interesting. For instance, now once again, for folks who don't know, who haven't seen, excuse me again, for folks who haven't seen my video, the introduction to the Venus synodic cycles, none of this will make any sense unless you watch that video first. But if you do watch that video first, I'm going to start off just by saying, and look, maybe you love ABBA, maybe you don't like them. I think they're fine. I'm not like a massive fan, but I did go and read a couple of biographies and listen to all their records a bunch of times because I just found this astrological signature really interesting. 3 out of the 4 members of ABBA were born during the red interval. So we have Agneta was born with Venus coming out of the direct station almost at its greatest eastern elongation. So not long, she's born after the Venus retrograde, but still in the red interval, because the red interval really measures between the greatest western and greatest eastern elongation of Venus. That's within a day or so of when the red intervals begin and end. And to my mind, those are really sort of the goalposts, if you will, that mark the beginning and ending of the retrograde phase. Not some people sort of go measure it just by what they call the shadow, when Venus reaches the degree that it's eventually going to station direct at. But I extend that. I find that the greatest elongation of Venus is, and this is when Venus is sort of, it's at its greatest distance from the sun, and it's quite bright in the sky. Not at its absolute brightest, but it's quite bright. And that's the sort of Venus she has. But she is born in the red interval, close enough, 43 days after the direct station. Husband Bjorn is a red 1 interval. He was born with Venus actually retrograde in Aries. And then Benny is a red 2 interval, and he is closer to the direct station than Agneta. He's born with Venus morning star having gestation direct 8 days after the retrograde. And then the outlier is Annie Frida, who was born during a white 5 interval. And so that's a morning star Venus, bright, but not the brightest. Quite bright, actually. That'll be quite a bright Venus. They're still quite far apart. But she's sort of the outlier of the group. And as I understand, even like, I mean, the 4 of them, obviously they're 2 former couples and what have you. But my understanding is that she is kind of the recluse of the 4, and of course she's the Norwegian of the 4. The rest of them, of course, all being Swedish. So that's ABBA. I know you guys were just dying to know ABBA's phases. AC/DC, they're a bit more, I'm definitely more AC/DC than I am ABBA, personally. But AC/DC are not quite as, and here I have only they're AC/DC, the interesting thing with them is that out of the guys who've been in the band sort of longest, I don't have Brian Johnson in here, which I should get. I also don't have Cliff Williams, the bass player, who I should have in here. But just out of the other sort of standard 4 guys, Angus Young is the only white interval. I'm always interested, like, which one sort of falls outside the pattern, because this is what I tend to find with bands. Like, everyone's in one part of the Venus synodic cycle, and then another member's in some other part, and they kind of stand out in some way. Angus Young is nominally the group leader, although really I'd say his older brother Malcolm is. They were sort of like the anchor of the band, and Malcolm is the older of the 2 and really sort of wrote a lot of the riffs and stuff, though they wrote most of the songs together. But Angus, of course, is sort of the showman. If you've seen AC/DC perform either live or on TV, you can't mistake him. He's the guy playing guitar solos while dressed as a school kid. So definitely stands out in that way. But yeah, he's a white 1 interval, whereas the other main guys in the band, the late great Bon Scott, is a black 3 interval. The amazing drummer Phil Rudd, rock solid guy. Rock solid drummer anyway. I think he was arrested for arrested for threatening to murder someone at one point. But hey, these guys are bad boys. That's why we like our AC/DC. And he's a black 3 interval, just like Bon Scott, even though they're 8 years apart. And then Malcolm was a black 2 interval. So there's an interesting division there with the band. I will do a bigger thing on AC/DC at some point. I'm just showing them because that's the work I have so far. Now the Beatles. Okay. There's a lot I can say about the Beatles. This is right now I just want to sort of get into the Venus synodic cycle of the guys and people sort of related to the band. There is a sort of interesting story here. I'll start with the red 3s. There are 2 red 3s in the Beatles, Stu Sutcliffe and Ringo Starr. The thing is, these are 2 guys who were never in the band at the same time. Stu Sutcliffe was a founding member of the Beatles. He's the guy really who came up with the name of the Beatles. And Ringo, of course, was the last to join. He replaced Pete Best, and we'll get to him in a minute. Excuse me. But what I find interesting about Stu and Ringo being red 3s, Stu is a setting D red 3. Ringo is a rising B red 3. So Stu was in the Beatles when they were still sort of like teddy boys in leather, with hair, sort of 50s style, ducktail style hairdress, like sort of 50 greaser. But Stu, when the Beatles went to Hamburg, Stu got into a relationship with, where is she? Astrid Kircher. And they met because Astrid's boyfriend, Klaus, who is a black 3 interval, just like Astrid, Klaus, they were a couple, and Klaus got into an argument with Astrid one day, and he went for a walk, and he wound up in the Reeperbahn, and he wound up in this club where the Beatles were playing, and he was really blown away by the band. And so then he brought some friends, including Astrid, to see the Beatles. And um and yeah, and Astrid immediately sort of fell for them. And Klaus and Astrid broke up, but I think they were still friendly, and she started dating Stu. And Klaus already had what we would call a sort of Beatles hairstyle. Astrid, styled his hair this way, and she styled her own hair that way. And then she wound up styling Stu's hair this way, like the way you see in this photo, Beatles style. And at first, the other Beatles sort of made fun of him for having this hairstyle, but one after another, they wound up copying him. So he's sort of, I mean, the Beatles haircut is really important, as you imagine. Like when they do become a big sort of sensation, it's part of their trademark. It's part of the reason they really, uh, uh, the screaming girls, all the things about Beatlemania. That hair is a huge part of it. When they go ooh, when they sing songs and stuff and shake the hair, I mean, then girls freak out. It's a cornerstone of what makes the Beatles, at least in those early years. And that all comes from Stu. Like if Stu hadn't gotten the haircut first, it never would have happened. So he was sort of, yeah, he was like not the mascot, but he sort of set the Beatles. Like I said, he named the band, and the haircut is a really sort of important thing. Um, and then he left the band to stay in Hamburg and pursue his life as an artist, but he died of a brain hemorrhage in 1962, before the Beatles became famous. And so that gives him that sort of James Dean, like, young and tragic kind of mythos. But he died before Ringo even joined the Beatles. Ringo joined the Beatles in August of 62. And when Ringo joins the Beatles, now, musically, he's the drummer. I'm tempted to say he's just the drummer, not to sort of diminish Ringo, but he's not, I mean, he's in a band with Lennon and McCartney and George Harrison, these powerhouse songwriters and performers who are sort of a tight little group. And he's kind of the outsider, although they all in many ways, they all relate to him better than they relate to each other. The relationship is less complicated. So musically, I mean, he plays the drums. Occasionally he sings a song, usually one song per album, um, two songs on the White Album because it's a double album. But in the public image of the Beatles, again, it's kind of like Stu Sutcliffe. Stu Sutcliffe wasn't important musically to the Beatles, but he's an important sort of icon of those early Beatle years. And Ringo similarly is an important icon of the Beatles in the Beatlemania years. He's part of what, that he's got this sort of, this really tender cancerian face, you know what I mean? He's what makes them sort of seem lovable and cuddly, because he's got this lovable, cuddly nature to him. And in all the Beatle movies, he's kind of the star. If you see A Hard Day's Night or Help, Yellow Submarine, those three movies in particular, Ringo's sort of the not the leader, but the movie is more about him, and the other Beatles are kind of like, his buddies in the movies, which is not reflective of like what the Beatles' actual professional lives were like, what their real lives were like. But that's sort of the image, is that, Ringo's the lovable runt, and the other guys are like his buddies who sort of look after him. Is kind of the way that whole sort of thing emerges. So I'm interested in Ringo and Stu as being these, the red threes in the band, and being the yeah, like, I mean, Ringo's kind of like a mascot almost of the Beatles. And again, I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but I hope you know what I mean. Insofar as they were a band of these like four guys who looked identical and presented themselves as four equals, there was still something about him that stood out because he's, shorter and doesn't play a guitar. Now on to John. John is a white 2 rising bee. So both John and Ringo are rising bees. And in the end, 3 of 4 Beatles were born in rising phases as opposed to setting phases. That includes Ringo, John, and Paul, who I'll get to in a minute. But yeah, John is a white 2. And well, I'll come back to him in a bit. I know maybe people expect me to talk about him more. I've said this before. I tend to think of, like, when it comes to the Beatles and the planets. I know I said this previously on a stream, and maybe I covered a lot of this in a previous stream. Hopefully, you guys don't mind if you've seen me talk about the Beatles before, but just for the sake of completion. I think of Ringo obviously being the Venus retrograde. He's kind of he's like the Venus guy in the Beatles. Paul McCartney is Mars cycles in Paul's life are really, really powerful. This is something I've spoken about before. I'll do a presentation on a live stream at some point for Paul and the synodic cycle of Mars. But with John, John has this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. Ringo had it too. But John's got this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, and really, like, his life, in a way, you can tell the life story of John Lennon just looking at the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions. Here, I'll go to my Beatles file. And so this is my Beatles file, 2,310 charts, and I'll do a search for conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn. And let's give it a 3-degree orb. Start with that. Okay. All right. So sure enough, we get Ringo, we get John, and then we get the Beatles' debut at the Cavern. Their sort of their Liverpool debut after they come back from their first trip in Hamburg. Before they went to Hamburg, they were sort of I should just open these. Before they went to Hamburg, they were, they weren't very a good band by their own account. But then they went to Hamburg and played hours a night every night, and they got really good. And then they came back to Liverpool and started playing at the Cavern, and this is when they really started to take off. And you can see John's got the natal Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. Ringo wasn't in the band yet. This is still with Pete Best, but Stu Sutcliffe had just left. So this is when they just become a 4-piece. Paul McCartney's just switched over to bass from guitar. So they're really becoming the Beatles as we recognize them. And even though Pete Best is still going to be in the band for the next year and a half, they really are like the Beatles as we know them from here on. And this is a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, the first recurrence of John's natal conjunction. He had just turned 20 a few months earlier. And then, of course, 20 years later, the other Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in his life, I think you know where I'm going with this, is Lennon's murder, which also occurred at a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction quite close to his nose. Well, it would have been on his sun, close to his Mars as well, which is interesting considering how, we lost him, the transiting Mars and Capricorn up here at the time. So yeah, I mean, I think of, John, I don't think of him as much in terms of where his natal Venus is, phase wise. I have one thing to say about his chart that I'll say in a minute. But the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction for John, I mean, just, like he's born during one, the Beatles sort of become the Beatles during one, and then he dies during one. It's a really sort of simple timeline. Obviously, it leaves a lot of important stuff out of the story, but it is interesting the way you can sort of break his life down, his chronology down by those cycles. Let me just check in with the chat here, see if anyone's, whoops. It's not the window I'm looking for. Okay, some interesting questions here. Okay. Maz just released a solo album, says it's his best ever. Bride May of Queen. Yeah, I'll talk about Queen at some point. Probably not today. Comedy parodies following these cycle. That's quite a sophisticated question. I don't know if that's I don't know if I'm prepared to tackle that just yet, but it's an interesting question. All right. So yeah, John, I really think of him mostly in terms of the Jupiter Saturn conjunction. Insofar as his Venus goes, he's a Libra with Venus and Virgo. Yesterday during the team stream, I was talking about John Coltrane, who was also a Libra with Venus and Virgo. And I think the thing that John Coltrane and John Lennon have in common, I guess apart from the fact that their first names are John, is they both married women who were artists in their own right and who they sort of partnered, despite a disparity in their sort of status. John Coltrane's second wife, Alice Coltrane, Alice MacLeod was her given name, I believe. Really incredible pianist in her own right. And she eventually joined his band. She was in his band for the last 2 years of his life and really sort of carried on his legacy afterwards. She wasn't as controversial as Yoko Ono, but there is a parallel there because the music that Coltrane played in the last 2 years of his life was kind of as far out as, Yoko's stuff is in a way, really off the beaten track. And so in much the same way that, say, Beatles fans, when they were confronted with Yoko, were like, well, hang on, this isn't I Want to Hold Your Hand. It's not even I Am the Walrus. This is, really weird. We can't handle this. What's going on? Except they were a lot, nastier about it. I'm not going to get into that. I'm someone who rather admires Yoko. But there's this sort of feminist sort of thing to the partnerships of John and Yoko and John and Alice, insofar as the well-known male icon sort of lifted and spotlighted the gifts that their partners had, their women partners, and promoted them. So I think there's something to that. Libra with Venus and Virgo. Yoko's chart is really interesting. I'll get into that sometime with another sort of a more in-depth Beatles look. Linda is a Black 5 interval, as was Neil Aspinall, who was an important, he was like the road manager for the Beatles. And then we get to the next Red 4 pair. And again, it's two guys who are really important to the Beatles, but didn't really work together ever. Apart from one day in May of 1962, the Beatles had their their audition for Parlophone Records. And George Martin liked the Beatles. He just didn't like Pete Best's drumming. And he said, well, I'll get into a session drummer for the recording. And unbeknownst to him, the Beatles were already thinking of firing Pete Best, which they did in August and replaced him with Ringo. So both Beatle drummers were born during red intervals. George Martin is a setting E Red 4. Well, actually, so is Pete Best. Yeah, I mean, I think both these guys, their thing with the Beatles, I mean, obviously George Martin is really important to their music, whereas Pete Best was sort of their drummer. But the thing about Pete Best is he never cut the Beatles hairstyle. At least he eventually did, but only long after leaving the Beatles. And he was really he wasn't part of their camaraderie. And I think you get the same thing with George Martin. George Martin was, musically the fifth Beatle in terms of musical, in terms of what they did in the recording studio. But obviously he wasn't a mop top. He was an older guy, like 14 years older than John Lennon. So they weren't like sort of buddies. They didn't, do LSD together or anything like that. So George was kind of, part of the group in a way, but sort of outside at the same time, as was Pete Best. All right, then we get to Paul McCartney, who is a rising C, white 3 rising C. So yeah, the Lennon McCartney team is a white 2, white 3 partnership, and like I said, the 3 of them were born with morning star Venuses. Paul's got this really interesting chart where almost everything's got dignity, right? I mean, it's, Venus in Taurus, Mercury in Gemini, Jupiter in Cancer. Quite the chart, and quite the popular guy. Paul is a Mars guy, and I'll get into that when I talk about the Mars synodic cycle. Then we get to Brian Epstein, who is a blue 2 rising C. So it's interesting that there are 2 rising Cs. You'll see this as like there's a lot of sort of pairings in a way. So Brian Epstein and Paul McCartney are both rising Cs, probably the 2 most business-minded. Well, obviously Brian Epstein had to be; he was their manager, and he's the only blue 2 interval in terms of the band's inner circle. And then finally, we get to the 2 black 1s, Mal Evans and George Harrison. Mal Evans was like the second road manager along with Neil Aspinall, who was a black 5, as you'll recall. So when you think in many ways, like when the Beatles were touring, you really had like John, Paul, George, Ringo, Neil, and Mal. And when you think of them as a 6-piece that way, I mean, sure, when they'd go to America, Brian Epstein would come along sometimes. Most of the time when they were just touring Great Britain in a van in their early Beatle years, it was the 6 of them traveling around, and you had 3 white intervals and 3 black intervals. And then George is the one guy in the musical group and he really is the guy, maybe when the Beatles started, Ringo was the outsider, but George Harrison is the Beatle who really didn't enjoy being in the Beatles. He's the only Beatle who had transiting Saturn transit over a lot of his planets during the Beatle years, because Saturn was in Pisces in 64, 65, 66, right at the height of Beatlemania. And you can really tell he did not enjoy Beatlemania. He spent a lot of it sort of kind of freaked out and kind of disgusted by the scene and overwhelmed by it, I think, more than anything. And sort of emotionally detached. And this sort of continued. He was the least committed to being the Beatle and the most sort of reluctant Beatle. And so you can see how, like, he's the only evening star of the Beatles. You can see how he sort of stands out from the other 3. Right. And then there's just 2 other pairings. John's Aunt Mimi and his mother, Julia Stanley Lennon, were both blue 4s. They were 8 years apart. So Julia gave birth to John, and then Mimi raised John. And so there's this interesting link between the sisters. And then finally, Klaus Vormann and Astrid Kircher are both black 3 setting Cs. The interesting thing about Klaus Vormann being a black 3 is, remember, Paul McCartney is a white 3. And there's this really interesting thing that happens. It's a very kind of Beatles thing. Like, okay, Klaus went to see the Beatles and Stu was playing bass. And then Stu wound up, quote unquote, stealing Klaus's girlfriend, Astrid. But then Klaus wound up picking up the bass and learning how to play the bass. He actually became a really good bass player. I think he was a fantastic bass player. He's also a graphic artist. He did the cover artwork for the Revolver album. If you're familiar with that cover art, it's really gorgeous. He did that. But also then once the Beatles were breaking up, Klaus played bass, on John's early records, on George's early records. If you watch the Concert for Bangladesh, he's the bass player in the Concert for Bangladesh. The first 2 John Lennon records, George Harrison's All Things Must Pass. So in other words, he's sort of, Stu Sutcliffe stole his girlfriend, and then he kind of, in a way, becomes the bass player in the Beatles. I mean, he's not in the Beatles. That's right when they break up. But, in an alternative universe, John, George, and Ringo could have stayed together and played with Klaus. That almost could have happened. There were brief periods when it almost looked like that could happen. For instance, it's Klaus and Ringo who backed John on the Plasticono Band album, his first solo album. And then it's, Klaus is also on the Imagine album, and George Harrison appears on that album. So there's a lot of crossover with these guys. And I just find it interesting. Like, Klaus becomes a bass player. Like, he becomes the guy that he saw on stage, the guy who stole his girlfriend. There's all that sort of thing. It's also funny, like John and Paul have a thing like that, a sort of reciprocal switch in their lives, and that during the Beatle years, John lived out in the suburbs with his wife and Julian, whereas Paul was the one Beatle who lived in London and sort of enjoyed the city life. This is why he was exposed to sort of all the avant-garde stuff before John was. Paul was the first one to sort of make, avant-garde tape loop sort of things like Revolution Number 9. But then towards the end of the Beatle years, John took up with Yoko, and he wanted to have Paul's life. He wanted to live in London and sort of do the whole art scene. Whereas Paul, sort of left London. He took up with Linda, and they got this farm out in Scotland. And in other words, John and Paul like almost traded lifestyles. John, who had spent the Beatle years secluded in suburban Surrey, so from then on was like a city, art snob kind of guy, in London and then later in New York. He was never a suburban guy ever again as the Beatles broke up. Whereas Paul was never a city guy again after the Beatles broke up. He became this sort of rural recluse. So they sort of switched lives in a way, which is kind of funny. And in many ways that kept going. I mean, I kind of think of John and Yoko's Double Fantasy album as being like John making a Paul and Linda kind of record, if you know what I mean. Just a beautiful, well-crafted pop record. But anyway, I digress. I've spoken too long about the Beatles. I wonder if I've lost all of you now. Oops. Let me just check in on the chat. The Zodiacal release. Okay. Miles and Betty Davis, that would be interesting. The Beatles Zodiacal releasing. The problem with the Beatles is the birth times aren't 100% with them. But it'd be an interesting exercise. I do have my own feelings about where the birth times are. That's a whole subject in itself, but they wouldn't be my first choice. When I want to demonstrate, when I want to demonstrate zodiacal releasing, I usually want to use like really sort of solid, solid timed birth time charts with solid birth times. I'm sorry, I'm losing my control of the English language. So they're not my first choice to sort of demonstrate zodiacal releasing. Of course, it is a great tool for to use in rectification and maybe in some. Oh, good! I'm getting some real Beatle fan comments here. Cool. So yeah, they wouldn't be my first choice, but maybe sometime I'd do an episode where we have some fun rectifying the Beatles charts, and then I would look at their zodiacal releasing. But yeah, they're not my first choice to just sort of demonstrate zodiacal releasing. All right, I'm going to move on to some other bands. I wanted to sort of cover very quickly everyone on this list. Now the Bee Gees, like I said, I'm particularly interested in groups where there are siblings or spouses. So I mean, the music I love tends to be like heavier stuff. The Doors and the Who and Led Zeppelin and even the Smiths, like their rockier stuff or whatever. Obviously Nirvana, Soundgarden. I mean, I tend to be a heavy rock guy, but I like pop. I like the Carpenters, ABBA, and the Bee Gees, but I almost never just sort of like put them on and listen to them. That's not my style, but I do admire them. But I find the astrology interesting. Okay, here you go with the Bee Gees. So you got Robin and Maurice, who are twins, are both red 4 intervals, setting E. And then their brother Andy Gibb, who is 8 years younger, is also a red 4. He's a rising C red 4. And then even Barry's a black 3, but he was born, his birthday is September 1st. And Black 3 converted to red 2 on September 4th. So he's born within 3 days of a red interval. Very, very close. 56 days before the retrograde station, which means his progressed Venus probably went retrograde around 2002. And his chart, very early in life progressed from a black 3 to a red 2. That's the other thing about secondary progressions is you can, in some instances, progress from one interval to the next. Someone mentioned Freddie Mercury earlier. Freddie is just a little bit younger than Barry. He's born right on the edge. I think, that's the thing about Freddie is I don't even know if he's a black 3 or red 2. I think he is born like around September 4th, 1946, if I remember correctly. Well, that's an interesting. Anyway, I showed you ABBA and how 3 out of 4 members of ABBA were red interval people, and that's also true of the Bee Gees, and actually 3 out of 4 if you include Andy, who wasn't a member of the Bee Gees, but he's a Brothers Gibb and also a pop star. I don't have a slideshow yet for Creedence Clearwater Revival, but they're another band. There's 2 brothers in that band, and 3 out of the 4 members of Creedence Clearwater Revival are red interval births. So that's another. I've been meaning to make a slideshow for them, but when you take the Bee Gees and CCR, AC/DC, you could see we're a bit of an outlier where you do have brothers, but you don't have any red intervals in that band. Although a lot of things in the AC/DC chronology, the events in the band's career happened during red intervals, but the members don't have red interval charts. But as I'm showing you, CCR, Bee Gees, ABBA, there's a really heavy emphasis on red intervals. And I'll go to another band of brothers, a band that has brothers, and you'll see we get the same thing again. Don't worry, I'll go to these other groups on the list, but I just wanted to show that the sibling thing. Van Halen. 3 out of 4 members in Van Halen were born during red intervals. So Alex Van Halen, the drummer, during a red 1. Mike Anthony, the bassist, the outlier in a way, is or one kind of outlier. Sorry, I'm just going to fix that. Is a black 3 interval. David Lee Roth is a red 2 setting C. And then Eddie Van Halen is the only Morning Star member of Van Halen, but he's also a red 2, born just not long after David Lee Roth. So it's another one of these things. I just find it interesting that, the bands can be sort of skewered in this way. All right. I think the next one I'm going to show is Led Zeppelin. All right, so Led Zeppelin, it's a bit more spread out, but not that much. So John Paul Jones is a blue 4, rising E, and then Jimmy Page is a white 4, rising D. Robert Plant is a red 3, rising B. So these are the 3 Morning Star guys in the band. So just like the Beatles, you've got 3 Morning Star guys and 1 Evening Star guy. And then John Bonham is also a red 3, but he's a setting D. The thing I really find interesting, now I mentioned earlier, John Bonham is a major influence on me. One of my all-time favorite musicians. I'm a drummer guy. I love drummers, so much so that I even have a chart file of drummers, and which I don't have for any other. I don't have a file of singers or guitar players, but drummers I do. Because I have a particular fascination with the instrument. Play it myself, not the greatest drummer in the world, but I do play, or I did play. But 3 of my favorite drummers, 3 hard rock drummers, there's a lot of red interval drummers. We'll get into that. But these 3 guys are born within about a month or so of each other, 2 months, 2.5 months of each other. But they're the 3 drummers in the 3 most important sort of hard rock bands of the 70s. Bill Ward of Black Sabbath, John Bonham of Led Zeppelin, and Ian Pace of Deep Purple. And they're all red 3 guys. They're all born during the red 3 interval. In fact, I think I might even No, I don't have one for Ian Pace, but yeah, that's just sort of, their charts are really, really similar. And, so much so that even Ward and Ian Pace have them, well, I don't know what time they're born, but their moons are sort of close to the same position. And even Bonham, like, it's entirely possible that they all have Pisces moons, for instance. If only we knew. These two guys are still alive. I've tried. I once got in a huge fight with Bill Ward's webmaster. I was like begging him, please ask him what time he's born. He's like, no way, I'd lose my job. You guys have no idea the lengths I've gone to try and get some people's times of birth, and like, yeah, 9 times out of 10, it's it's a failure, and usually like some really humiliating situation. Yeah, I put myself in all kinds of funny positions trying to get times of birth. I could tell you guys stories. But yeah, there's just, there are a lot of red interval drummers, not all of them, obviously. But I showed you Ringo's a red 3, just like those guys. And yeah, I mean, I could, there's at one point, there's one year in 1962 where you get like 4 drummers born like, November 27th to 28th of 1962. These 4 drummers are all red 2 drummers. It's Charlie Benante of Anthrax, Mike Borden of Faith No More, Matt Cameron of Soundgarden and later Pearl Jam, and Jeff Ward of Ministry. So you get some interesting things like that. And even, yeah, that red 2 interval of 62 had, a bunch of other drummers as well. Anyway, back to the bands. Let's see who else we have here. Whoops, what happened? Oh, did Keynote just, no, I don't know what just happened. I'm working my way up to some of the bigger Oh yeah, since I'm on the hard rock thing, I'll go through this quickly. The Metallica story is interesting. I'll try and cover all these bands. Keith Moon, I'll get to in a minute when I get to the Who. Yes, Columbus, America, you did see the Jacksons, but that's going to be the last one I cover because I cover all the Jacksons, and it's a very large family, so I'm saving the big one for the last. Kinks, yes, I also mean to make a Kinks file. There's also no red interval guys in the Kinks. Kinks and AC/DC are interesting in that way. I don't have a slideshow for the Kinks yet, but definitely one of my favorite bands of the 60s, and definitely one that I will include in a future one. Okay. But yeah, Keith Moon, I will definitely get to Keith Moon. In fact, I was just listening to the Who when I was in the shower, not like an hour ago. I had the Who live at Leeds, cranked very loud and singing along to Young Man Blues while I cleaned my body. All right, so I'm opening up Metallica for now. There we are. Now again, like, even if you don't really, I'm not much of a Metallica fan. They're okay, but I was never a big fan. I saw them live once because they played a concert with Guns N' Roses in Montreal in '92 at the Olympic Stadium, and James Hetfield was burned by a stage effect. He was caught fire, and they rushed him to a hospital, and he was treated for burns. The concert was obviously aborted, and then they came back to Montreal the following year, I think in the spring of '93, if I remember correctly. And they played 2 nights at the Montreal Forum for really cheap ticket prices as a sort of makeup concert because of the accident. So the price was so good. I was like, yeah, why don't I go see Metallica? And it was a pretty good show, I got to say. But I've never been like a massive Metallica fan. By the time they were getting big, I was really kind of done with heavy metal. In the early 80s, I was a big Iron Maiden fan, Motorhead, Van Halen. Those were my bands circa 1980, 81. But Motorhead got rid of their guitar player. That pissed me off. Iron Maiden got rid of their great drummer, Clive Burr. That pissed me off. Van Halen, just like, after 81, I didn't like their last 2 records that much, although they were still a fun live act. So I was a real snob, and just sort of like, I knew what I liked, and I was done with metal and kind of got more punky after that. But so yeah, when I kind of missed the Metallica boat, if you will. I had a lot of friends who were into them, but they weren't my vibe. But I just want to tell this really interesting story. So you've got the late great Cliff Burton, who really was an amazing bass player. So he's a Blue 4. He's not merely a blue four. He's one of these, excuse me. He's one of these sort of incredible 1962 Aquarians with this massive stellium. You can see in Aquarius here, Saturn, Mars, Mercury, South Node, Jupiter, Sun, and Venus, all in Aquarius, with the moon in Taurus, opposite Neptune in Scorpio, and Uranus in Leo, a chart that's almost all fixed. He's a Libra rising, but not the kind of Libra rising who is, dressed all spiffy and what have you. He's wearing your classic metalheads uniform, the Canadian tuxedo and all that. But yeah, Cliff was an amazing bass player, and he was killed in a very unfortunate way. But first, let me just show you Kirk Hammett, the guitar player in Metallica, who is a red 2 interval, and Venus retrograde in Scorpio. There's this famous accident, how Cliff died. Cliff died also during a red 2 interval. So Kirk was almost 24 years old. And what happened was the band was on a tour bus in Sweden, and the bus, I think, slipped on some ice and turned over. And what happened was, the bus crashed, and once they all sort of got themselves safely, they realized Cliff had been caught under the bus and crushed and killed. Now, the reason this is interesting with regards to Kirk is that when he was killed, Cliff was sleeping on the spot on the bus where Kirk usually slept. That they were touring on this bus, and usually the 4 guys sort of slept in their own designated spots in the bus. But for some reason, I forget why, that night, that fateful night, Cliff was sleeping in the spot that Kirk was. And so Kirk has this sort of survivor's guilt. He talks about this pretty openly, for instance, in that documentary they made, something with monster in the title. I forget. It was like 20 years ago, when they were making that Saint Anger album. But yeah, that's, he has survivor's guilt. And it's interesting to me that it was during a red 2 transit that this thing that really traumatized everyone in the band. I mean, in many ways, the whole Metallica story revolves very much around the fact that the 3 survivors of that bus accident never really worked out the sort of the trauma of what happened to their friend, this immensely talented musician who played with them. All right, so that's Metallica. That's an interesting story. All right, someone said Keith Moon. These will be fairly quick until I get to the Jacksons, because like I said, there's 9 kids in the Jacksons, a lot of people to talk about. All right, but I'll just quickly go with The Who. The Who, you've got Roger Daltrey is a white 4 rising D. You get John Entwistle is a black 2 setting B. And Pete Townsend is a red 1 rising E. And then Moon is a black 3 setting C, born not too long before Barry Gibb and Freddie Mercury. What can I say about The Who? So you get, in this band, you do get 2 rising and 2 setting. The dynamic in this band is super interesting. So interesting. There's so many weird things about this band. I mean, they started off really hostile towards each other. The early days of The Who, they're always on the verge of breaking up. They're always broke because they're breaking their instruments at every concert. I find it interesting that they have sun signs in the 4 elements. Keith Moon was a Leo. I mean, almost a Virgo, but he was a Leo. Pete Townsend is a Taurus sun with the Venus retrograde, Venus coming out of the retrograde there in Aries. John Entwistle was a Libra, and Roger Daltrey is a Pisces. So you get the fire, the earth, the air, and the water. And the other thing I find interesting about The Who, it's more of a Saturn story. There's a way you can tell the story of The Who just according to which member of the band was having a Saturn transit at a particular time. Let me find my Who file. Uh, left my glasses in the other room. I'll have to remember never to do that. All right, let me just do a search and I'll find the file quickly. Sorry, it's taking a minute, folks. There we are. Like I said, I left my glasses in the other room, so. All right. So, I'm going to start with Roger, the Pisces. There was a period when he was fired from the band for a little bit. He got in a fist fight with Keith Moon and punched him and knocked him out. And he was fired from the band just before they wound up recording My Generation. So where is, I think, yeah, this is the gig, I believe, where he's fired. Yeah, right. Because Roger Daltrey flushed Keith Moon's speed down the down the toilet. It's a kind of classic. So Roger Daltrey winds up punching Keith Moon in September of '65. They're at a gig in Copenhagen, and here I can put Roger's ankles in there because we do have a birth time. Roger punches Keith Moon, knocks him out, and he's kicked out of the band. And for the next month or so, the Who are going to continue as a three-piece. But then Roger sort of goes back to the band and he says, from now on, I'll be Peaceful Percy, and, you know, please let me back in the band. And he sort of, he founded the Who. He was the leader. But Pete Townsend was already sort of taking over leadership because he was the, sort of the songwriter and the visionary of the band. So this was sort of Roger really sort of formally saying, look, I want to be a member of the band. I don't need to be leader. I won't punch anyone anymore. I promise, blah, blah, blah. And they let him back in on a sort of probationary period. And he's going to continue to be in a probationary period really with them, really until Tommy comes out in early '69, when he really sort of emerges as a star and, finally stops straightening his hair, which I can't believe this guy ever straightened. He has this amazing curly hair. Why was he straightening his hair in the '60s? Anyway, enough of that. But the point I want to make, what I'm going to show you is we can tell the story of the Who, the four individual members of the Who, just looking at the Saturn transits to their sun. And it tells sort of the story of the band, at least the sort of the first, not including all the sort of reunions they've had, but the core sort of story of the Who with these four guys. So first we get Roger Daltrey, Saturn in Pisces conjunct his sun, and he's fired from the band and he's on probation. He's got to sort of earn his stripes again. The next member of the band to get a Saturn transit to his sun is Pete Townsend. And this happens when they are working on the album that follows Tommy in 1970-71. This is close to it. That gig at the Young Vic where they sort of preview the songs. Yeah, that'll have to do, but it's close enough because this is when they're recording. So Pete Townsend, of course, wrote the rock opera Tommy, and it's this huge success of what makes the Who, a major band as opposed to a struggling band. And they have to have a follow-up, and he has this new concept album he calls Lifehouse, and it's an amazing sort of concept, but it's really abstract. In a way, it kind of anticipates the invention or introduction of the internet conceptually in the story. I won't go into the details of it, but long story short, the story is so convoluted, the band doesn't really understand it, but there's some great songs that are supposed to be part of the story. Songs like Behind Blue Eyes, which is a song that is supposed to be like the villain in the story's anthem. And but yeah, Baba O'Reilly, Won't Get Fooled Again. These are all songs that are part of the Lifehouse story. But ultimately, the project is taking too long, and no one really understands what Townsend is trying to do. And so they abandoned the concept, and they just put out this record, "Who's Next," which is one of my favorite Who records. Like, Live at Leeds is my absolute favorite record by anybody. But yeah, but Who's Next is a fantastic album. It's just not a concept album. It's sort of reduced. It's the record cover, the four of them peeing on this stone obelisk, like really, sort of deliberately unpretentious. But this is Pete Townsend. He's got the Saturn conjunction on his sun as they're making this album. This chart is for a gig they played as they were trying to introduce the material and explain the story. But this is sort of really fell apart. Um, um, so yeah, Pete Townsend, even though I would not consider this a failure at okay, sorry, I have to chase away a phone call. Um, Pete is the one who is, you know, um, sort of struggling with disappointment, even though I think Who's Next is an amazing achievement. I mean, Baba O'Reilly, Won't Get Fooled Again, and Behind Blue Eyes are, three of the band's most popular songs. But he's dealing with what he considers a sort of failure, the fact that he couldn't get this follow-up concept album done the way he wanted to. And later on, he would sort of recreate the whole Lifehouse project, but it got very, very complicated, and he was kind of at a low ebb. So, I showed you how Roger had Saturn on his sun when he was fired from the Who temporarily, and now Pete is the one who's sort of struggling. For some reason my light just went off. He's the one who's struggling. He's the one who has Saturn conjunct his sun. Okay, now the next member of the Who to get the Saturn transit is Keith. And now I just want to warn you, most people get Saturn conjunct their sun, and it doesn't mean death usually. And in fact, I don't think that's what the transit meant for Keith. In fact, when he died, Saturn was already in Virgo. But when Saturn was in Leo, leading up to his death, he was trying to overcome his demons. That's the real sort of irony here. I'll go a few months before his death when the Who record. They do a one-off concert to film them performing Baba O'Reilly and Won't Get Fooled Again for the movie The Kids Are All Right. If you're a Who fan, you know the performance I'm talking about. And this was just a few months before Keith died, and you can see Saturn was approaching his sun. So he died shortly after Saturn was on his sun. But this is Keith really sort of, in the last years of his life, he's trying to cope with his alcoholism. And the irony of his death is that he died by overdosing on medicine he was taking to cure his alcoholism. So it's almost like it's not alcoholism that killed him, but sobriety, or his attempt to be sober. But yeah, I mean, he was someone who was always trying to sort of live up to his legend, and he, just became very self-destructive, notorious wild man, and just a a really different musician from. I mean, Keith Moon sort of played the drums amazingly, despite not really having any sort of the standard technique that a drummer that even someone like. Even Ringo has this sort of, he keeps time and he does the drummer's job, or, even the guys I was talking about earlier, your John Bonhams, your Bill Wards, your Ian Pace, like drummers with tremendous technical skill. Keith Moon was just pure feeling, like, and he made a lot of mistakes, but most of his mistakes were just brilliant mistakes and really, really original. And yeah, just a hell of a performer. And so, yeah, this next chapter, like I showed you, Roger had his Saturn transit in the Who, and Pete had his Saturn transit. Now Keith has this Saturn transit, unfortunately, as he struggled in the last period of his life. And then finally, actually my favorite member of the Who, the guy who really made me a Who fan, John Entwistle. Incredible bass player. When the Who did replace Keith Moon when he died with Kenny Jones, and they existed a few more years until finally sort of packing it in 1982. And when they performed their last gig, I remember I watched this live on TV, their last gig in Toronto. Saturn had just moved into Scorpio. But in this sort of last year of The Who's career, when they decided they would break up, he was the one who didn't want them to break up. Because, he was, he'd sort of he didn't have anything else really. He had made some solo albums, but they were never very successful. Um, Roger Daltrey had a movie career and a solo career. Pete Townsend also had a solo career. But Entwistle really needed The Who. And later on, when they would eventually reunite, it would mainly be because he really needed the money. But yeah, when The Who released their last album, It's Hard, a few months before that last concert, Saturn was still in Libra. And Saturn had been on his sun when they basically decided that this was going to be it. This was going to be their last tour. This is what happened. They released It's Hard and they said, okay, we're going to tour and it's going to be our farewell tour. Obviously it wasn't, but no one really realized it at the time. And they would reunite for a one-off for Live Aid 3 years later. And then they would reunite again in 89 for a tour. But then it wasn't until the late 90s that the Who were really revived, and was because Entwistle was really, really broke. So here, as the Who are sort of deciding that they're going to be no more, and Entwistle doesn't know what he's going to do with his life from there on. Saturn is on his sun. So I just find it interesting. Like I said, like the way we can tell the story of the Who just according to these Saturn transits to their sun. So that's my little Who story. And let's see, where do I go next? Yeah, I'll quickly do the Doors and I'll work my way up. This will be short. I don't really think of the Doors as being, a Venusian sort of band as such. They were only around for a very, very short period. But I do find, like I was saying earlier with the Smiths, the Doors are a band that I'm so intrigued by the chemistry of these specific four musicians. I think, I do like Jim Morrison. Certainly when I was 12, 13 years old, I wanted to be Jim Morrison. But I'm no less enthralled by him than I am by the other three musicians in the band, and the way that the four of them work together. That's just so unique. And so, it's that telepathy that musicians develop. They had it in spades. These are four guys who could read each other's minds, musically, and react to each other the way jazz musicians can. Really, really, and such unique players, all of them. None of them sounds like anyone else who plays their instrument in rock and roll. So Robbie Krieger is a Blue 4. This Blue 4 in 1946, I always find very interesting. A lot of interesting people. I'm going to go to Pink Floyd in a minute. You'll see that Syd Barrett and David Gilmour are both Blue 4s, born close to him. I showed you John Paul Jones of Led Zeppelin is born just a few days of Robbie Krieger. A lot of really, really amazing musicians born in this little window of time, this Blue 4. John Densmore, who is he's the one setting B in the Doors, and he is kind of an outsider in the Doors. He and Jim Morrison never got along very well. I think there is one story that Jim Morrison actually wanted to kick John Densmore out of the band before they had a record contract. I would say, thankfully, they didn't, because I think his drumming worked really well in the Doors. And in fact, there's when you listen to Doors records, you can hear this rapport just between Densmore and Morrison. Even if they didn't get along too well personally, I think musically there was this really, really amazing connection between singer and drummer. Later on, after Jim Morrison died, Densmore, he wound up having a falling out with Ray Manzarek, and they both wrote books complaining about each other. It's always kind of heartbreaking. I'm going to go into Pink Floyd in a minute, and I hate it when I hate it when the grown-ups fight. Incredible drummer, and you can see, like, again, in these bands where one guy sort of is born in a different phase than the other guys, and he's sort of the outsider in the band. Like I was saying, George Harrison and the Beatles. Jim Morrison is a white 4 rising D. Remember Roger Daltrey was also a white 4 rising D. Um, that this period in 43, 44, there's also, you get the Mars retrograde with Uranus and Gemini and stuff. So it's a real bad boy period. Keith Richards, we'll get to the Stones in a minute. He's a 43 guy. He's got the Mars retrograde and all this stuff. And yeah, Jim Morrison, Keith Richards, Rick Danko of the band, these real rock and roll poetic, bad boys. There's a lot of white 4 in that's one of the things that sort of typifies them. And then the antithesis of Jim Morrison, the logical, cerebral, sane Ray Manzarek, amazing keyboard player, the late great Ray Manzarek. He's a white 1 interval. And yeah, kind of the guy who pulls the whole thing together. If the Doors had a leader, I think he would be it. He was the older guy. He was kind of, the grown up in the room when it came to the band. And yeah, there we are. That's the Doors. Any of these groups I'll talk about a lot more at some point. But I'm just sort of doing the run through now. I'll go to Pink Floyd, and then I'm going to skip Elvis because that's a big one. I hope no one was. I will talk about Elvis at some point, but that's more of a Mars presentation, and that's like his whole biography. But I'll do Pink Floyd, the Stones, and the Jacksons for today, and then we'll call it a day for now. But I'll just take you through Pink Floyd. Pink Floyd, one of my favorite bands when I was in high school. That they're arguing again. Gilmour and Waters are arguing again. I sort of boycotted Pink Floyd in 1987 when they reunited without Roger Waters. I don't know. I'm too sentimental. I got a Taurus moon. Change disturbs me. Remember, I gave up on Motorhead when they left their guitar player left. And I gave up on Iron Maiden when their drummer left. I get really, finicky, especially when I was a teenager. But yeah, I do love their records and stuff. And like I said, they were one of my favorite bands. So the 5 guys in Floyd, you get, first of all, the red interval guy, Roger Waters. He's born in the summer of 43. So he's a red 5. This is an interesting, the summer of 1943, you get some really, you get a lot of sort of visionaries. Mick Jagger, you'll see in a minute, is also born this summer. He's a red 5 interval. Robbie Robertson of the band. Robert De Niro, not a musician, but also another one of these sort of really powerful personalities that you find with the red 5 interval. So Roger Waters, definitely, lyrical and sort of conceptual genius behind Pink Floyd, but really strong assertive personality, almost to a fault. You can see he was born in the interior conjunction of Sun and Venus retrograde, and he's got the Mars Uranus that you saw with Jim Morrison a minute ago, but the Mars isn't retrograde yet. It goes retrograde later. Good bet that his progressed Mars is retrograde now. That would be something to look into, is when Roger Waters' progressed Mars went retrograde. Roger Waters, not so much of a bad boy per se, not like in the Jim Morrison, Keith Richards sense, but definitely sort of a sort of conceptual visionary like those guys are. And he's a rising D interval, right? So then we get to Nick Mason, who is a white 4 rising D. And Rick Wright, who's a white 5 rising E. So far we've got, all these rising guys. And then even Syd Barrett, blue 4 rising E. So the original 4 guys in Pink Floyd was all Morning Star. Pink Floyd was all Morning Star in the early days. But then Syd Barrett, he's basically an acid casualty. And even though he was, really, really important main songwriter and singer in the early days of Pink Floyd, he wound up leaving the band. First, he was replaced with David Gilmour, who's a childhood friend of both Syd Barrett and Roger Waters. But he introduces a setting C interval. He becomes the new sort of guy in the band. Though in some ways, I think of Roger Waters being more the outsider these days. But Really, I think, David Gilmour, having been the new guy in the band who had to sort of find his way in, was at least the outsiders things were starting. And yeah, he's a blue 4 setting C, and Sid Barrett is a blue 4 rising E. And remember, I was showing you John Paul Jones and Robbie Krieger of the Doors were also blue 4s born around this period. Okay. And now we're going to go to the Stones, man. I'll do the Stones and then the Jacksons. I'll leave Elvis for another day. Let me check in on the chat. How's the chat enjoying this? Are we? I gave up on Metallica when they cut their hair. Sad but true. That's hilarious. Tiffany Greer. I'm sending Leo energy. What's my other 2 out of the big 3? I'm a Leo rising Taurus moon, just like Mick Jagger, who we're about to look at. Oh, sensing. I see. What software do I use to calculate the synodic interval? I designed it myself. There's no software in the world calculates it. I'm presently, we were talking about this yesterday on the team stream, but I'm training AI eventually to memorize this. But I made this, I designed the interval system myself. Because like anything you invent it because you sense its absence. This is my sort of quasi ephemeris of the Venus synodic cycle. So this is what I use when I want to quickly look something up. But I made this. Eventually, we will have software that calculates it. But for the time being, we don't. And you got to just sort of come to me, if you watch my introduction to the Venus synodic cycle video, I at least sort of teach you how to sort of keep track of it yourself. All right. Adam Davis has some great. Okay. I'm enjoying all of Adam's comments. There are lots of them. All right, cool. Everyone's enjoying this. Cool. I'm glad. My God, folks, I've been carrying this material around for years and not talking about it. Or, I used to talk about it to Watson and Chris like 15 years ago, but I've just been sitting on it for the longest time. All right, we'll do the Stones and the Jacksons. The Stones. Okay, some interesting stuff with the Stones too. The 2 sort of guitarists who joined the band later, Ron Wood, Mick Taylor, are both white interval guys. They're guys who had to sort of find their way in the band. Both of them, Mick Taylor replaced Brian Jones when he died. And then when Mick Taylor quit, Ron Wood replaced him. But I think, both of them faced this situation where they were walking into the world's biggest band, biggest rock band, and, just found themselves in the middle of the circus, and both had to sort of sink or swim. Both have conducted themselves beautifully. I think, Mick Taylor in particular has just really added a lot to the Stones, but you can really understand how Ron Wood sort of fits in the band. You get a sense with Ron Wood that he was always meant to be in the Stones. But yeah, they're both white interval guys. Then we get Charlie, who I got to update this slide because we've lost Charlie. He's died now, but I haven't he died so recently that I haven't updated his slide. He's a blue one. Remember, a lot of those other drummers are red intervals. I was showing you Ringo, Bonham, so on and so forth. Not Keith Moon, true. But anyway, Charlie Watts is a blue 1 interval. Really, super sane guy. He's a Gemini, not unlike Ron Wood. Ron Wood and their birthdays are a day apart, although they're 6 years apart. So Ron Wood's a white 1 and Charlie Watts is a blue 1. But yeah, just not a rock star, really, sort of more of a jazz fan. Funny thing about Charlie Watts is he developed a heroin habit in like the mid 80s, when he was in his mid 40s. Not, he had already been in the Stones for like 20 years. He had seen Keith Richards and Brian Jones wreck themselves with drugs, and he had always been this very sober, sane, happily married, doting father kind of guy. I think he's got like a farm with ponies or something like that out in the country. So, not some reckless rock star, but for one reason or another, he was playing. He had his own sort of jazz orchestra when the Stones were on hiatus during the 80s, and for one reason or another, developed a heroin habit for a little while. Which, but you got to hand it to the guy. He waited till he was like in his late 40s to start that kind of thing, and I think it didn't stay with him. It's something he went through and then got out of, but just kind of interesting to me. Um, all right, now for the really glamorous Stones. Brian Jones was a red 4 interval, as was his love. There was a love triangle. Anita Pallenberg was originally Brian Jones's girlfriend, and they were sort of like twins. And then she left him because he was an abusive prick, really. Genius musician, vulnerable guy, but an abusive prick. And I mentioned, I told a little anecdote yesterday about that, but she left him for Keith, and she wound up being the mother of Keith's 2 children. And that they were together for a good decade or so. But yeah, they're both red 4 intervals, and they were always thought of as sort of like twins, like when they were a couple. So that's kind of interesting. Now, you might remember, I did a stream a few weeks ago where I talked about revolutionaries with red 4s and red 5s. So Brian Jones is a red 4, and Mick Jagger is a red 5. And I don't know if you remember, if you saw this stream, I'll probably talk about this again. But if you go into the history of, excuse me, of revolutions, I was talking about how, in the French Revolution, you had Robespierre was a red 4 and Danton was a red 5, just like Jones and Jagger. And the red 4, red 5, they're sort of like you get a partnership that is sometimes, sometimes they're at one point they're enemies, and at one point they're allies. And in a way, there's an element of that between Brian Jones and Mick Jagger in terms of who was in charge of the Rolling Stones. There was the same thing. Like I went from Robespierre and Danton in the French Revolution. In the Russian Revolution, Lenin was a red 4 and Trotsky was a red 5. Same thing. Like sometimes they were against each other. Um, and then in the Chinese Revolution, Mao was a red 4 and Chiang Kai-shek was a red 5. Once again, sometimes allies, sometimes enemies. So there's this sort of pattern that I've seen a few times with red 4s and red 5s. And yeah, sure enough, Brian Jones and Mick Jagger have this same sort of dynamic between them. And I mentioned Mick Jagger being a red 5, born in the same summer of 1943 as guys like Roger Waters of Pink Floyd, Robbie Robertson of the band, real sort of songwriting visionaries and band leaders who really sort of seem to have an instinctive sense of how to lead their band to greatness. And then, yeah, Keith Richards. I already talked about the white 4, with regard to like Jim Morrison and Rick Danko, this Mars-Uranus conjunction with the Mars retrograde and whatnot. Yeah, sort of poetic bad boy kind of. What else can I say? I mean, it's Keith Richards. He is who he is. Master Sagittarian. Also, the band's first manager, Andrew Loog Oldham, it was also a white 4, and he was very much. He was also kind of just as wild as the band. He wasn't like Brian Epstein, who sort of stood off to the side. Andrew Oldham was really had the sense that the Stones should be the anti-Beatles, that they should really run with the bad boy image and sort of crafted that. And then finally, you get Bill Wyman, who's a black 2 interval. You might remember I also talked about red 4s and black 2s being a kind of partnership. Martin Luther King was a black 2 and Ralph Abernathy was a red 4. Huey Newton was a red 4 and Eldridge Cleaver was a red 5, and they were friends and enemies. But then Bobby, what's his name? The co-founder of Black Panthers. I'm just driving. Huey Newton and Bobby. I'm just suddenly sort of drawing a blank, as we do. But he's a black 2, red 4, black 2. There's a lot of people in the 60s, a lot of combination, red 4 and black 2. Even like Nixon was a black 2, and then Khrushchev was a red 4, and Mao was a red 4. So even in like global diplomacy of the age, you had a black 2, red 4 kind of. There's just something about that pairing that you see a lot in the 60s. The Kennedys, the Kennedy children. Carolyn Kennedy is a red 4, and John F. Kennedy Jr. is a black 2. And when their father was killed, they're sort of icons as well. I could go on. There's so many that's a whole sort of book in itself, talking about all the different sort of red 4, black 2 combinations, along with the red 4, red 5 one. Excuse me, I really am losing my voice. I'll finish up with the Stones and get to the Jacksons. I just wanted to show Marianne Faithfull. I did once, speaking of people I've asked their birth time, I once waited outside a venue in Montreal for 3 hours to ask Marianne Faithfull her time of birth. She was performing a concert, and I waited outside the stage door. She came out quite drunk, and she said she thought she was born between noon and 1, but I've left this as an untimed chart. Anyway, she's a red 2 interval. Yeah, and so she and Anita Pallenberg are both red interval women, and they do tend to be these very often red interval people are sort of more provocative, more bent on sort of pushing the envelope of standards, or yeah, they're movers and shakers, and they switch things up. I mean, that's part of what the Venus retrograde does. It sort of moves things around, changes the standard, changes the values and the mores. And it's kind of scandalous. When the Stones were arrested for drug possession in 1967, Marianne Faithfull was really sort of denigrated in the press, really just because she was the woman in the bunch. And, she'd been I think she had just had a shower, and so she was wearing a fur rug when the police busted her. So they made it sound like there was some kind of orgy going on. But that's also something that happens to red interval people is they get sort of caught up in scandal in some way. Sometimes by design and sometimes by accident. Okay. And I'm just going to go to the Jacksons, and then we're going to be done for today. I'm glad people have enjoyed the music thing. Gosh, if I'd really known, I would have done this years ago. Let me see how the comments are going. Bobby Seale. Thank you, Reverend Kai. Yes, Bobby Seale. When I was talking about Black Panthers, sometimes you just blank on a name. Bobby Seale was a black 2. Huey Newton was a red 4. Eldridge Cleaver was a red 5. So it's another example of, the red 4 and black 2 being this really sort of strong unit, but also the red 4 and the red 5 being sometimes friends, sometimes enemies, which is totally something that happened with Newton and Cleaver. Fleetwood Mac. Yes. Okay, Laura says, kind of reminds me of Jimmy Chamberlin. Jimmy Chamberlin is also a red 3. You remember I was talking about drummers who are red 3s like Bill Ward, John Bonham, Ian Pace. Jimmy Chamberlin, my favorite drummer of the 90s, is a red 3. And Paradigm Shift is asking about Fleetwood Mac. I just don't have a slideshow for Fleetwood Mac. But also another one, as you can tell, I'm interested in bands that are spouses or siblings. Stevie Nicks is a red 3. She was born that same period that Bill Ward, Bonham, and Ian Pace were born. She's a Gemini, born in 48. So she's born in a red 3. And then Christine McVie, the late, great, beautiful Christine McVie, was a red 5. So the 2 women in that band are red interval people. And yeah, talk about scandal. I mean, that's the amazing thing about Rumors is, this band singing about how pissed off they are with each other, with, breakups and all that stuff. It's, wow, what drama, right? But yeah, I'd love to talk about Fleetwood Mac at some point. Okay. All right. I'm getting really nice feedback. Thank you, people. Laura says, I'm especially curious about the charts musicians that wind up involved with multiple big acts because it's so rare to get into even one major band. Okay, that's why you were thinking of Jimmy Chamberlin. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, just when you look at an individual's life and the sort of the changes that they go through, that is also interesting and something worth doing. Okay. All right, let's do the Jacksons and then we're going to wind it up for today because my voice is going on me. I'm really fascinated by families. So, with the Jacksons, you get some really interesting sort of patterns. Well, one particularly interesting pattern, but I'll just take you through the family, interval by interval. So, Latoya is a red 3. She's the only red interval in the Jacksons, and she was kind of the rebel of the Jacksons. Yeah, remember the Jackson family, they're Jehovah's Witnesses, but, she posed nude in Playboy in the mid '80s, which was, not something her family was crazy about. Um, Certainly not the kind of thing Michael, would have approved of. He was, despite his proclivities, quite a prudish, guy. So yeah, she's, again, that thing about red interval sort of, finding their way in scandal, is not uncommon. And sure enough, she's the one Jackson who's a red interval person. Michael notwithstanding, I mean, obviously, but Michael wasn't sort of courting a scandal quite the way Latoya was. Um, Next up is okay. Well, Quincy Jones isn't one of the Jacksons, but I figured I would just throw him in here because I study him. He's born not long after Yoko Ono, so they in 1933. So you get this amazing Virgo with the Mars retrograde. Um, people like Nina Simone, Yoko Ono, Quincy Jones, they all are born around this time, and it's a really, really powerful dynamic between the Virgo and Pisces stuff. The other blue one in the Jacksons, well, the blue one in the Jacksons is Marlon Jackson, who is the brother immediately older than Michael, the one that Michael was closest to, because they were closest in age. Um, but mainly his fame is limited to the Jackson Five as a group. But next week, this is the really interesting thing to me about the Jackson family. Um, we get three white threes. Three of the siblings in the Jacksons are white threes. First off, we get Rebby Jackson. She's the oldest sister. You may not have ever heard of her because, I mean, she did become a singer. Like when they had a TV show, she was on the TV show with them in the '70s. But she's not, a big famous Jackson. She's the oldest of the Jackson siblings. And she's a white 3, and that's not necessarily remarkable in itself. But then you get Michael and Janet are also white 3s, which I find really interesting because they are the two superstars of the Jacksons. And some of you might remember I did a talk a little while ago on the white 3 interval and how many, amazing sort of musicians, songwriters, icons are white 3s. Paul McCartney, Miles Davis, Prince, and Madonna, as well as Michael. A huge list. Stevie Wonder. They're all white 3s. So really, really strong emphasis. I mean, you get amazing. I've shown you, musicians, amazing musicians, obviously, who are born in any of the 20 Venus intervals. But there is something about that white 3 interval when it comes to sort of songwriting and being sort of like, mega musical genius. The fact that, Janet, Michael, Paul McCartney, Stevie Wonder, Miles Davis, a bunch of others. I had a whole talk on it. I won't go into it now, but all white 3 intervals. So I find that really, really interesting. Um, Now, the other thing about Janet is she has a Sun Mars conjunction in Pluto, and she's 15 years younger than Jackie, who also has a Sun Mars conjunction in Pluto. Because you can see they're almost exactly 15 years apart in age, and the one synodic cycle of Mars is 15 years. But it is interesting to me that you get two siblings who have the Sun Mars conjunctions. Jackie, you got to sympathize. I mean, he's the oldest boy, the second oldest child. And he winds up as a backup singer to his little brother, who's like 7 years younger, who kind of outclasses him as a performer. But that couldn't have been easy. And when you see those old Jackson 5 clips, especially when they were really young, and Jackie's like this tall and Michael's like this tall. It's a striking sort of visual. Joe Jackson is a blue 3 setting B. That's what I am, actually. I'm a blue 3 setting B. Yeah, Joe is, what can we say about Joe? Known to be not the nicest guy, but definitely, you would not have had a Jackson 5 without Joe Jackson's, drive and push. I mean, he made those kids rehearse and tour and do all that stuff, and he's what turned them into superstars, at least until they landed at Motown. I have a whole thing to do about Motown, but that's just too much to handle today, as I've already gone. We're an hour two, and I'm going to have to end soon. But yeah, that's Joe. He's the one blue interval in the Jackson family. You remember Latoya? Oh no, sorry, I spoke too soon. I forgot. Marlon is also a blue interval. Latoya is the only red one. Um, and then you get another pair. It's also like, remember, these three are white five. Sorry, these three are white threes, and then you get even two white fives. Tito and Randy are white fives. This is interesting to me because Tito was the guy always playing guitar in the original Jackson 5. And then when Jermaine quit, Jermaine was the bass player. Randy kind of came in as a bass player, keyboard player, conga player. So you get two white fives in the family. Remember, there are 20 intervals. But in this family of 9 kids, you get like 3 white threes and 2 white fives. And I'm interested in that overlap. And then finally, there's Catherine, the mother, who is a black 3 interval. Yeah, so she's a black 3 setting C, and remember that her husband Joe is a blue 3 setting B. So there is a bit of a lineup there. All right, I'm going to leave it there with the Jacksons. I'll leave Michael's image up. Actually, I'm going to stop sharing altogether and go to my restream window. And thank you all. Let me just see one other question from Pixies. Oh yeah, it's another band I got to talk about, the Pixies. I helped get Black Francis's time of birth, actually. You're welcome. I'm a huge Pixies fan. I would love to talk about the Pixies sometime. There's 2 members of the Pixies have the same birthday, actually, which is interesting. Kim Deal and Joey Santiago. They're Geminis with the same birthday. Close kind of to like what we saw with Ron Wood and Charlie Watts. What I say, there are correlations between personality traits and the Venus phase people are born in. Pixies, that's a great question. I'm in the middle of answering and uncovering it. There are some things I've seen that I think are, I see sort of threads, like what I was just saying about the white 3 interval and all these amazing songwriters. I did another thing with red 1 intervals and leaders who are sort of, I was talking about Catherine the Great, Napoleon, Hitler, who are sort of leaders who expand territory. Catherine the Great is the one who first conquered Crimea and annexed it, and Napoleon, of course, conquered all of Europe, and Hitler, did his Hitler thing. So, yeah, there's something about red 1 and land expansion, or white 3 and composition and music. I do get these little sort of glimpses of not necessarily personality, but some kind of theme. Maybe it's just like, maybe it is just coincidence. Maybe I'm not looking at anything, but they're very interesting coincidences is if that's the case. Eagles too. Yeah, I'd be into talking about the Eagles. Okay. All right. Columbus, America. Greetings from Europe. Okay. Your name's Columbus, America, but you're in Europe. Well, I don't judge. That's all right. We're all one planet, right? That's how I see things. Okay. All right, Pixie, you're paying attention. Okay. Yeah, I'm spent for the day. This has definitely been my favorite solo live stream so far, so that's encouraging. If it just gets better and better, I'm more and more comfortable doing it. Maybe I'll just get better at doing it, but I'm really grateful for all the kind words and comments, and just for the attention. The fact that you're out there listening is what makes it worth it for me to do. I had a really funny experience on Friday when the YouTube stream didn't go out, and I really did feel like I was speaking to no one, which was disappointing because I thought that at that point that was the best one I'd done. But this is good. This has been a lot of fun, a lot of interaction, and I'm really enjoying it. Yeah, I'm going to close by reminding you folks that my website address is nickdaganbestastrologer.com. I'm available for consultations. And yeah, if you're looking around for astrologer to read your chart, I'd be happy to do it. I do get a lot of, even just like, working astrologers often book consultations with me as well, because I do all this work with synodic cycles, and even people who've read every astrology book in the world, don't have access to this Venus material that I've developed, and I similarly Mars synodic cycles, which is also really useful to know. Um, so yeah, that kind of work. But I also do regular old horoscopic astrology. I'm trained in Hellenistic astrology, and I'm sort of hybrid Hellenistic and modern astrologer. Rectification work, teaching secondary progressions, zodiacal releasing, you name it. I can help you. So, yeah, if you're looking for an astrologer, please keep me in mind. nickdaganbestastrologer.com. And I will be back for the next solo live stream on Friday, probably at 2 p.m. again, but I'll always schedule it a few hours ahead. So you just, keep your eye out, and hopefully that works for you. If not, of course, you don't have to watch it live. And then Sunday, Watson and I are going to do another team stream. So my solo streams are Mondays and Fridays. The team stream is on Sundays. I hope you guys will keep tuning in. I'll keep doing my best to entertain and educate. And yeah, have yourselves a great day. Bye for now. Cheers.